Why was the room so certain she didn't belong there? Kira stood near the edge of the briefing table, hands relaxed, shoulders still. The men around her leaned in, pointing at maps, murmuring wind estimates and ballistic coefficients like sacred numbers. No one asked her opinion. No one looked twice at the wooden rifle resting against the wall behind her. It looked old, out of place, like her. She learned long ago that silence often invited dismissal, and she'd learned not to fight it. The desert outside the range was waking slowly, the kind of dawn that felt older than nations. Cold air sat low against the sand, carrying the faint scent of sage. Kira breathed it in, eyes drifting toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, the land was already speaking. Lieutenant Holloway cleared his throat. Standard courtesy evaluation. 1,000 meters first. Civilian participant will observe until called. Civilian. The word landed softly, but it stayed. Kira nodded once. She wasn't here to argue, she was here to listen. Her mind drifted back to a morning long before she ever touched a trigger. She was 6 years old, barefoot in the Arizona sand. Her grandfather knelt beside her, older than time itself, hands steady as stone. "Watch the mesquite leaves," he'd said. "The wind tells you everything." She hadn't understood then, not fully, but she'd watched anyway. Now, decades later, she felt the same quiet pull in her chest, the same sense that something unseen was moving, waiting. The SEALs fired first. Clean shots, tight groups, professional, efficient. Steel rang in the distance like punctuation marks on a sentence everyone already knew. Then someone finally said her name. "Ms. Redwing, your turn." A few glances followed her as she stepped forward, curious, skeptical, mildly amused. She didn't rush. She walked left of the line and stood still, closed her eyes, let the wind brush her skin, then right, then back to center. She slipped off her boots and pressed her feet into the sand, feeling the cool firmness beneath the surface. Some of the men shifted uncomfortably. She knelt, touched the earth, waited. There was a moment, always was, when the world seemed to settle into place, when noise fell away, when listening became something deeper than hearing. She scattered sand from her pouch and watched the grains drift. She tasted the air barely, felt the heat beginning to rise. Only then did she take the rifle. The wood fit her shoulder like memory. No calculations, no devices, just breath. The shot echoed low and deep, different somehow. 7 heartbeats passed. The steel sang. Dead center. No one spoke. She fired again and again. 5 shots, one story. When she stepped back, brushing sand from her knees, the silence felt heavier than applause. "How did you?" one of them began, then stopped. "I listened," she said simply. Some scoffed quietly, others didn't. But something had shifted. And not all truths reveal themselves at once. What if everything they trusted was only part of the truth? The heat climbed fast as the distance stretched farther. 1,500 meters, mirage rippling like water over the sand. The SEALs recalculated, adjusted, compensated. Their hits were good, still impressive. Kira repeated her ritual. Someone muttered luck under their breath. She didn't hear it, or maybe she did and let it pass. Her shots threaded through the distortion like it wasn't there. Perfect. That was when Colonel Grant stepped closer, older than the others, watching the rifle, not her. "This isn't a weapon," he said quietly. "It's a record." Kira met his eyes. Something old recognized something old. When he spoke her grandfather's name, her chest tightened. The past stirred. Grant told them things the desert already knew, about a man whose methods were buried because they didn't fit clean lines, about knowledge dismissed because it couldn't be quantified, about a shot prepared, then taken away. Kira listened, jaw set, fingers resting on the blank space of wood her grandfather had left untouched. "I promised him I'd try," she said. The range fell silent. The extension was approved. 2,000 meters. Then 2,500. The men struggled now, not from lack of skill, but from limits they hadn't known existed. Kira didn't celebrate her hits. She absorbed them, adjusted, learned. One of the SEALs watched her hands, her eyes, the way she waited between shots. "She's not guessing," he whispered. "She's responding." By the time she centered 5 shots at distances that broke doctrine, disbelief had given way to something quieter. Respect. But the question remained. 3,000 meters was already pushing the edge. And she was thinking beyond that. What do you do when the land asks you to finish what history interrupted? That night alone, Kira ran her fingers over the carvings in the walnut stock. Generations etched into wood, wind patterns, temperature notes, shots taken, shots survived. And one space left blank. Her grandfather's voice returned, not loud, never loud. "One day, you'll take the shot I never could." She slept little. At dawn the air was perfect, almost too perfect. 3,500 meters broke even the strongest confidence. The SEALs missed, not badly, but enough. Kira prepared longer this time, walked farther, read deeper. Her shots landed center. No cheers, just stunned quiet. Colonel Grant told her the rest then, about 1961, about the mission that failed, about blame placed where it didn't belong, about a man who carried undeserved shame until the end of his life. Kira felt something break, not loudly, just enough to let resolve breathe. "Then I'll take the shot," she said, "not to prove anything, to correct something." No one argued. That night the desert watched. What does it cost to carry the weight of unfinished truth? The final morning came still, sacred almost. Kira walked the full distance to the target, over 2 miles, step by step, learning every breath of land her bullet would cross. She placed a small stone at the base of the steel, a marker, a promise. When she returned, sweat lined her brow. Fatigue lived in her muscles, but her eyes were clear. She prepared for 40 minutes, sand, air, sound. She chambered a single round, hand-loaded, etched with 2 sets of initials. NR 1961. KR 2024. She breathed. 7 seconds of flight. 7 seconds where history held its breath. The steel rang. Perfect. No one spoke at first. Then confirmation, then hands to faces, then knees in sand. Kira didn't smile, she exhaled. She carved the final notation into the wood herself later, quietly, precisely. Not a trophy. A sentence finished. Why do some truths wait so long to be heard? The reports would come, slowly, bureaucratically, but they would come. Nathan Redwing's name would return to record, his methods acknowledged, his silence finally answered. The SEALs asked to learn, not as students chasing secrets, but as professionals humbled by depth. Kira agreed, with one condition. "This isn't quick," she said, "and it doesn't belong to me." The desert didn't applaud, it never did. It simply remained. And as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows over sand that remembered everything, one quiet truth settled into the air. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the air feel heavier the moment she stepped back from the firing line? Kira didn't turn around right away. She stood where she was, rifle resting against her thigh, eyes still on the distant shimmer of steel. The sound of the impact had already faded, swallowed by the desert, but something else lingered. A pressure, not from the shot, but from the silence behind her. Silence could be louder than doubt. She sensed it before she heard it, the subtle shift of men recalibrating what they thought they knew, chairs scraping, a breath held too long, no applause, no congratulations, just the quiet discomfort that follows when certainty cracks. Kira welcomed it. Discomfort meant something had moved. She knelt and began clearing the rifle with slow, deliberate motions. The wood was warm now, the walnut stock carrying the memory of recoil, of breath, of time. As she worked, she felt the familiar tug in her chest, the one that always came after a good shot. Not pride, not relief, something closer to grief. Because every time she did this, she felt him. Her grandfather had never raised his voice. Not once. When people talked over him, ignored him, dismissed him, he simply waited. The land had taught him patience long before people tested it. Kira rose and finally turned. The SEALs were watching her differently now. Lieutenant Holloway was the first to meet her eyes. His expression had shifted from polite professionalism to something unsettled. He was a man who had spent his life trusting systems, training pipelines, equipment checklists, data-driven decisions. He wasn't arrogant about it, just confident. And confidence, when shaken, didn't always break cleanly. That grouping, he said carefully, was tighter than ours. Kira nodded once. The conditions were kind. Brennan let out a short breath, half laugh, half disbelief. The conditions are never kind at 1,500 meters. She didn't argue. Arguing wasted energy. Instead, she crouched and pressed her fingers into the sand, feeling the subtle warmth creeping upward as the sun climbed. The desert was already changing. It always did. Mirage is increasing, Mercer muttered, glancing at his kestrel. Winds shearing at different heights. Kira looked up. Yes. Just one word. Ashford tilted his head. He had been watching her since the first shot, not the rifle, not the target, but her. The way she moved, the way she waited. You adjusted before the gust, he said quietly. Kira met his gaze. The wind announced itself. Callahan snorted softly. Wind doesn't announce anything, it just happens. She smiled then, not sharp, not defensive, gentle, almost sad. It does, she said. We just stopped listening. That landed harder than she intended. Commander Hayes cleared his throat, stepping forward as if to restore order. Let's proceed. 1,500 meters confirmed. Same protocol. The steel was reset farther out. Heat shimmered in long waves now, bending the horizon. At this distance, even small errors multiplied into misses. Kira felt the desert stretching, testing attention. The SEALs shot first again. They worked efficiently, adjusting for mirage, compensating for wind. Their hits were solid, respectable, but the tight certainty from earlier was gone. The desert had introduced doubt, and doubt changed everything. When it was Kira's turn, she didn't rush. She walked, not far, just enough. Bare feet sinking slightly into sand that looked uniform but wasn't. She felt the ground cool beneath the crust, sensed how moisture hid where stone shadowed stone. She scattered sand again. This time she frowned. Something had shifted. Not enough to scare her, enough to demand patience. She waited. Brennan watched through his scope, puzzled. What's she waiting for? Ashford answered without looking away. The low. What low? The wind cycle. Kira inhaled slowly. The desert exhaled with her. Then she fired. The impact rang clean. 5 times. Perfect. No one spoke this time. Callahan lowered his binoculars and rubbed his face. That's not luck. No one argued. But doubt has a way of fighting back. At 2,000 meters, the desert stopped being forgiving. Mirage thickened until the target seemed to float. Wind layered itself in contradictions, left at ground level, right higher up, curling unpredictably where heat rose from stone. The SEALs struggled now, not because they lacked skill, but because their tools gave them averages and the desert was dealing in moments. Holloway missed center by nearly 2 feet. Brennan cursed under his breath. Mercer recalculated twice and still went low. Ashford hit closest. Kira noticed. She noticed everything. When it was her turn, she took longer than before. 15 minutes. She walked farther, knelt more often, pressed her palms flat against the sand and closed her eyes. And for a brief moment, the noise inside her grew loud. Not the desert herself. This was always the hardest part. Because listening meant quieting more than the world. It meant quieting fear, expectation, memory. She thought of her grandfather kneeling beside her, his hands guiding hers, correcting nothing, only asking questions. "What do you feel?" "I don't know," she'd said once. "That's okay," he'd replied. "Listen longer." Now, decades later, she did. She adjusted her position by inches, not measured, felt. The rifle spoke. "Center." Again. 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 When the last shot rang true, Brennan lowered his scope slowly, as if sudden movement might break something fragile. "How?" he said, not accusing, now searching. Kira stood, brushing sand from her hands. "You're solving the problem after it happens," she said. "I'm responding while it's happening." Mercer stared at his weather station. "This thing gives me exact data." She nodded, "At one point in one place." Silence stretched. Colonel Grant stepped forward then, his presence shifting the gravity of the moment. He hadn't spoken much. He hadn't needed to. "Your grandfather," he said quietly, "taught me something once, without meaning to." Kira looked up sharply. Grant's gaze was distant now, locked somewhere far behind the horizon. "He said the land doesn't change, people do, and when people stop listening, the land waits." He looked at her. "I didn't understand that until today." Something tightened in Kira's chest, not pride, recognition. The extension to 2,500 meters came without argument. This time, no one pretended it was routine. At that distance, the desert became unforgiving. The heat was punishing. Mirage distorted reality. Even identifying the target took effort. The SEALs fired with focus, sharpened by humility. They missed more than they hit. Kira prepared longer than ever. She walked nearly 100 yards, studying terrain features no one else noticed. Rocks half buried, subtle rises, the way certain plants leaned permanently, shaped by prevailing wind over years. She felt the weight of eyes on her back. Expectation pressed hard. This was where it always got dangerous. Not physically, emotionally. Because when people begin to believe, failure stops being private. She knelt, breathed, listened, and fired. 5 shots. 5 truths. Callahan removed his cap slowly. "I've been doing this wrong," he said, voice rough. "Not badly, just incomplete." Kira met his eyes. "We all do," she said softly, "until we don't." The sun was brutal now. Sweat traced lines down her spine. Fatigue crept into her legs. But inside, something steadied. She touched the blank space on the rifle stock. Not yet, she thought. Not yet. Because the hardest distances weren't measured in meters. They were measured in history. And history wasn't finished listening. Why did the desert feel less like a place now, and more like a witness? By midday, the heat had turned unforgiving. It pressed down on the range with a quiet authority, bending light, warping distance, testing patience. Sweat darkened collars. Hands lingered longer on canteens. Even the SEALs, men trained to operate where comfort never existed, felt the strain. Kira felt it too. Fatigue crept into her calves from hours of walking and kneeling. Her shoulders carried the familiar ache of recoil and focus. But deeper than the physical weight was something else. A tightening behind the ribs. A sense that the ground beneath her was no longer neutral. The desert was paying attention now. Commander Hayes wiped his brow and glanced at the distant markers. 2,500 meters is beyond standard evaluation, he said, tone careful. We can stop here. No one answered right away. Kira didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, where heat shimmered like memory refusing to stay still. "My grandfather stopped being asked at this distance," she said quietly. That landed heavier than any statistic. Colonel Grant straightened slightly. He'd been reviewing notes, video timestamps, wind logs, all the things institutions trusted, but his eyes softened when he looked at her. "What happened beyond this distance," he asked, "was never written down." Kira nodded. It wasn't allowed to be. Silence settled again, thick and reflective. Holloway finally spoke. "We continue." It wasn't a command, it was consent. At 3,000 meters, the world stopped behaving. The target was barely distinguishable through optics, more suggestion than object. Wind moved in layered contradictions, each elevation telling a different story. Mirage danced violently, making the steel appear to drift like something alive. The SEALs prepared anyway, because preparation was what they did when certainty failed. Holloway fired first. His shot landed wide. He exhaled slowly, jaw tight. Brennan adjusted, trusting instinct over software this time. His round clipped the edge. Mercer took nearly 10 minutes, recalculating, cross-checking, then hesitating. When he fired, the bullet missed entirely. He sat back hard, staring at his hands as if they had betrayed him. "I did everything right," he said, "not to anyone in particular." Ashford watched the vegetation downrange instead of his scope. He waited, fired. His shot landed closer than the others. "Still not center." Callahan shook his head slowly. "The desert, not meeting us halfway anymore." Kira had been watching all of it, not judging, learning. She noticed how the men reacted when they missed, how frustration tightened shoulders, how urgency crept in, how the need to fix things quickly replaced the patience required to understand them. When it was her turn, she didn't move toward the rifle. She moved away. She walked until the firing line was a distant murmur behind her. Nearly 100 yards out, she stopped and crouched, fingers tracing a shallow groove in the sand carved by runoff from a storm months earlier. This mattered. She closed her eyes. Her grandfather's voice surfaced uninvited. "They'll rush when they don't understand. Don't follow them." She pressed her palm to the earth and waited. Minutes passed. The heat was brutal now. Sweat pooled at the base of her neck. Her breathing slowed anyway. When she returned, her steps were deliberate but heavy. Fatigue showed now. No mystique, no illusion of effortlessness. She was human. She scattered sand from multiple heights, watching carefully. The grains didn't fall cleanly. They twisted, curled, hesitated. "Vertical component," Ashford murmured. Kira nodded once. She tasted the air again and grimaced slightly. "Humidity's shifting," Mercer said reflexively, then paused. "Isn't it?" "Yes," Kira replied. "It's uneven." She knelt behind the rifle. For the first time that day, doubt flickered through her chest. Not about skill. About weight. Because she could feel the expectation now. Not skepticism, but belief. And belief carried responsibility. She breathed through it. The rifle settled. She waited longer than before. The wind surged, then fell away. She fired. The shot felt right. 7 seconds passed. The steel rang. Center. Her shoulders sagged slightly, not in triumph but relief. She fired again. And again. And again. And again. 5 hits. Perfect. No one spoke at first. Then Mercer let out a shaky laugh that bordered on disbelief. "She's not fighting the conditions," he said. "She's cooperating with them." Grant lowered his binoculars slowly. His hands trembled, not from age but recognition. "This," he said quietly, "is what they buried." Kira stood and leaned on the rifle for a moment, eyes closed. Her legs were shaking now. Holloway noticed. "Take a break," he said. "You've proven." She shook her head gently. "Not yet." The word surprised even her. She walked to the rifle stock and ran her fingers over the carvings, stopped at the blank space. Her grandfather had left it untouched for a reason. Gran approached carefully. "There's something you should know," he said, "before you decide how far this goes." She looked up. "Your grandfather was assigned a shot in 1961, Grant continued. 3,800 meters. The number echoed inside her like a struck bell. He calculated it, prepared for it, but command pulled him off the mission. Kira's mouth went dry. "Why?" Grant hesitated, then answered honestly. Because he was a civilian, because he was Cherokee, because they didn't trust what they couldn't explain. Holloway felt something cold twist in his stomach. "They sent a team instead," Grant said. "4 of the best shooters they had all missed." Kira swallowed. "They blamed him," Grant finished. "Said his methods were unproven, unreliable. He carried that mark for the rest of his life." The desert felt suddenly very still. Kira looked back toward the horizon, where distance dissolved into heat and light. "I always thought the blank space was about possibility," she said quietly. "I didn't know it was about injustice." Grant nodded. "It's been waiting a long time." Her hands clenched briefly. 3,800 meters wasn't just a distance. It was a reckoning. Callahan broke the silence. "Ma'am," he said, voice rough, "you don't owe anyone anything." Kira looked at him then, really looked. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm going to do it." Fatigue burned through her muscles. Doubt pressed in from the edges. Fear whispered its oldest lie, that maybe this was too much. But beneath it all was something steadier. Purpose. She touched the blank space again. "Tomorrow," she said, "at first light." No one argued. As the sun began its slow descent, the desert cast long shadows across the range. Shadows that looked less like darkness and more like memory stretching forward. And somewhere between sand and sky, an unfinished truth waited, patient, silent, and ready to be heard. Why did sleep refuse to come when everything inside her was already exhausted? The night wrapped itself around the desert with a deceptive calm. The heat faded, replaced by a brittle cold that crept up from the sand and settled into bone. The camp was quiet, no laughter, no loose talk, just the low hum of generators and the occasional scrape of boots on gravel. Kira lay awake on her cot, staring at the dark canvas ceiling. Her body begged for rest, her mind refused it. Every time she closed her eyes, distance unfolded behind them, not measured in meters but in memory. Her grandfather's hands guiding hers, the smell of oil and dust, the way he would stop mid-sentence sometimes, eyes fixed on something far away, as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. She used to think those silences were mistakes. Now she knew better. She sat up and reached for the rifle case at the foot of the cot. The zipper whispered open. The walnut stock caught the dim light, its surface worn smooth by decades of care. She traced the carving slowly, stopping always at the blank space. 3,800 meters. The number lived inside her now, heavy, demanding. She closed the case without taking the rifle out. This wasn't about practice anymore. It wasn't about refinement. It was about trust. Outside, the desert breathed. She stepped into the cold, wrapping her jacket tighter around herself. The stars were sharp tonight, scattered across the sky in a way that felt intentional, almost arranged. She walked until the camp sounds faded, boots crunching softly against sand and stone. When she stopped, she took off her boots and stood barefoot again, letting the cold bite. This was where she thought best. Fear came then, not dramatic, not paralyzing, quiet. What if she failed? Not just missed, but proved them right. proved that the blank space deserved to stay blank, that her grandfather's silence was all he would ever be allowed. Her chest tightened. She knelt and pressed her forehead to the sand. "I'll listen," she whispered. "I promise." The wind answered, not with direction but presence. That was enough. At first light, the desert looked different. Colors muted, air dense. Sound carried strangely, bending in ways that made distance feel deceptive. It was the kind of morning her grandfather used to call honest. The range was silent when Kira arrived. No casual chatter, no distractions. The SEALs were already there, moving deliberately, setting equipment they knew would be of limited use. No one joked. No one tried to fill the quiet. Holloway approached her, hands clasped behind his back. "You don't have to do this," he said, voice low. "Not for us." She met his eyes. "I'm not." He nodded once. That was enough. Colonel Grant stood slightly apart, holding a weathered folder. He didn't open it. Didn't need to. His gaze followed Kira as she walked past the firing line and kept going. Farther than before. Much farther. She stopped nearly 200 yards out and stood still. The cold sand bit into her feet. She welcomed it, let it anchor her. She scattered sand slowly this time, watching how it hesitated before falling, how it drifted sideways, then dropped abruptly. Not stable. Not yet. She waited. Minutes passed. The SEALs watched through optics, unsure what they were looking for. Some checked watches, others didn't dare. Ashford murmured, "She's waiting for alignment." "Of what?" Brennan whispered. "Everything." Kira returned to the rifle with a measured pace. Her legs felt heavy now, not weak, just aware. She knelt and adjusted her position by fractions only she could feel. The rifle rested against her shoulder, like a familiar weight. She closed her eyes. Fear surged again, sharp this time. She breathed through it. Then another feeling surfaced beneath it, quiet, resolute. Acceptance. She chambered the round. This one was different, hand-loaded, balanced not just for distance but for forgiveness. The engraving caught the light briefly before disappearing into the chamber. She did not rush. She let the desert move first. The wind teased, then retreated. Mirage pulsed, then softened. There. She exhaled halfway. The trigger broke. The rifle spoke. Then silence. Longer than before. 7 seconds felt like a lifetime. The SEALs counted without meaning to. 4, 5, 6. The steel rang. Not a glancing blow. Dead center. For a moment, no one breathed. Kira stayed still, cheek pressed to the stock, eyes closed. Not yet. She chambered the second round. This one shook her hand slightly, fatigue finally making itself known. Her shoulder burned, her calves trembled. Fear whispered again. She ignored it. She fired. The weight stretched. The steel rang again. A third time. A fourth. Each shot a quiet correction, each impact a sentence finished. When the fifth shot rang true, Kira exhaled fully for the first time in what felt like years. She lowered the rifle and sat back on her heels, chest heaving. Tears came then, not loud, not dramatic, just steady. No one spoke. Colonel Grant removed his cap slowly, head bowed. Holloway stared at the horizon, throat tight. Ashford wiped his eyes without shame. Kira stood on unsteady legs and walked to the rifle stock. She took out a small carving tool from her pocket, her grandfather. Her hands were steady now. She filled the blank space. Not with numbers. With names. When she finished, she stepped back. The desert did not react. It never did. But something had shifted all the same. As the sun rose higher, light spilling across sand that had waited decades for this moment, One truth settled quietly among them all. Some distances are measured not by how far a bullet travels, but by how long a truth has been denied. Why did the silence after the final shot feel heavier than the distance it crossed? The echo had already faded, swallowed by the vastness of the desert, but no one moved. Not right away. The steel target still trembled faintly in the distance, a small, stubborn proof that what had just happened was real, that the land itself had agreed. Kira remained kneeling, the rifle resting across her thighs. Her breathing was uneven now, chest rising and falling in shallow waves. Every muscle in her body trembled, not from adrenaline, but release. The kind that comes when a long-held weight finally loosens its grip. She stared at the horizon, eyes unfocused. For the first time since she was a child, she felt empty. Not hollow, not broken, just open. Colonel Grant was the first to step forward. His boots crunched softly against the sand, each step measured, almost reverent. He stopped a few feet from her and removed his cap again, holding it to his chest. "I was there," he said quietly. 63 years ago, I watched them tell your grandfather he was done." Kira's throat tightened. She didn't look at him yet. "They said his methods were dangerous, unverifiable, that he was too intuitive." Grant swallowed. "What they meant was he didn't fit." She closed her eyes. "I didn't speak up," he continued. "I was young. I wanted a career. I told myself silence was neutral." His voice cracked just slightly. "It was." Kira finally looked at him, not with anger, not with judgment. "Understanding." "He carried that silence home," she said softly, "every day." Grant nodded, "and now it's finally answered." Behind them the SEALs stood in a loose line. No formation, no ranks, just men grappling with something deeper than success or failure. Brennan wiped his face with his sleeve and let out a breathy laugh. "I thought this job was about control," he said. "Data, certainty." Mercer shook his head slowly. "Turns out it's about humility." Ashford crouched near the firing line, eyes still locked downrange. "She didn't beat the distance," he said. "She respected it." Kira rose carefully, leaning on the rifle for balance. Her legs threatened to give out, but she stayed upright. Pride had nothing to do with it. She walked past the firing line without a word. Toward the desert. Holloway watched her go, then followed at a respectful distance. He didn't call out, didn't intrude. When she finally stopped, he stood beside her, facing the same direction. "I kept waiting for you to look back," he admitted, "to check for reaction, validation." She shook her head. "I already know what happened." He smiled faintly. "That kind of certainty scares people." "It used to scare me too," she said. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Holloway spoke again. "You could teach this." Kira didn't answer right away. "I don't mean formulas," he added quickly. "I mean awareness." She thought of her grandfather, of how he never taught directly, only guided attention. "I could," she said finally, "but it wouldn't be fast." Holloway exhaled. "The best things never are." Later, as the heat climbed and equipment was packed away, Grant approached her with a document folder. Official, stamped, heavy with delayed acknowledgement. "It's not enough," he said, "but it's something." She took it, didn't open it. "What matters," she said, "is that his name comes home clean." Grant nodded. Word spread quietly after that, not as a headline, not as a spectacle. As a correction. An amendment to a long-standing omission. Kira spent the afternoon alone, walking the perimeter of the range. Fatigue finally caught up with her. Each step felt like moving through water, but inside, something lighter moved with her. She stopped at a ridge, overlooking the valley, and sat down heavily. The desert stretched endlessly before her, unchanged, unimpressed, eternal. She smiled. That night around a small fire the SEALs gathered, not to celebrate but to reflect. Stories were told, failures shared, Laughter surfaced occasionally, tentative at first, then freer. Kira listened more than she spoke. At one point, Brennan glanced at her and asked, "Does it ever get easier?" She considered the question carefully. "No," she said, "but it gets clearer." Later, alone again, she carved one last small mark into the rifle stock, not for distance, not for history, for continuity. She slept that night, deeply, dreamlessly. And when morning came, it didn't bring urgency or expectation, just quiet, the kind that follows truth when it finally has nothing left to prove. Why did the morning feel unfamiliar when nothing around her had changed? Kira woke before the sun the way she always did, but this time there was no tension pulling her upright, no unfinished distance waiting in her chest, no number echoing behind her eyes, just breath, slow, even, real. For a moment, that unsettled her more than fear ever had. She sat on the edge of the cot and listened. The camp was still asleep. The desert outside held its quiet, not expectant now, complete. She pressed her feet into the cool ground and stayed there longer than usual, letting herself feel where she was instead of where she needed to be. That was new. She stepped outside as the sky began to pale. The horizon softened, colors bleeding gently into one another. No harsh edges, no demands. She wrapped her jacket around herself and walked without direction, letting instinct choose the path. At the far edge of the range, she stopped. This was where she had knelt yesterday, where the rifle had spoken for something older than all of them. Now, there was nothing to do here. And somehow, that felt heavier than the shot itself. She knelt anyway and pressed her palm to the sand. It was already warming. The desert never held onto the past. It acknowledged it, then moved on. She wondered if people could learn to do the same. Footsteps approached behind her, not rushed, not intrusive. Colonel Grant stopped a respectful distance away. "I thought you might be out here." She didn't turn, old habits. He nodded. "They don't disappear overnight." They stood in silence for a while. "I reread the file," he said eventually. "Every line, every footnote. The omissions are deliberate." Kira closed her eyes. "They usually are." Grant hesitated. "There will be questions from people who weren't here, who didn't see." "I know. They'll want explanations, replications." She finally looked at him then. "That's where it breaks." He studied her face, then nodded slowly. "Some truths don't scale." She smiled faintly. "Some aren't meant to." Grant removed his cap again, not out of ceremony this time but habit, and held it awkwardly. "For what it's worth," he said, "you didn't just correct a record." She waited. "You reminded us that expertise isn't ownership," he finished. "It's responsibility." When he left, she stayed kneeling, thinking about that word. Responsibility. By mid-morning, the camp stirred. Gear was packed. Vehicles idled. The rhythm of departure began. Kira moved through it quietly, helping where needed, declining attention without offense. Ashford approached her as she secured the rifle case. "I've been doing this for 15 years, he said. "I thought awareness was just another skill you layered on top of the others." She met his eyes. "It's not," he continued. "It's the foundation." She nodded. "It's also fragile." He smiled. "That's what makes it worth protecting." Brennan offered her a patch, not official, not sanctioned, just something from his kit. She accepted it without ceremony. Holloway walked with her to the transport vehicle. "What will you do now?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. "I don't know," she said honestly. He nodded. "That might be the right answer." As the convoy rolled out, Kira watched the desert recede through the window. Mile by mile, it returned to what it had always been, indifferent, enduring. She didn't feel like she was leaving something behind. She felt like she was being released. Weeks later, the world tried to make sense of what had happened. Reports circulated. Language softened sharp truths. Achievements were reframed as anomalies. Committees debated phrasing. Credit was distributed carefully, safely. Kira read none of it. She returned to Arizona, to the land her grandfather had loved without needing permission. She unpacked the rifle in the small workshop behind her home. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows, catching the grain of the walnut stock. She ran her fingers over the carving slowly. Names, dates, patterns, and the blank space that was no longer blank. She hung the rifle on the wall, not as a relic, but as a reminder. Then she sat down and waited. It didn't take long. A young woman arrived first, hesitant, curious, carrying questions she didn't yet have language for. They sat outside under a mesquite tree. Kira handed her a handful of sand. "What do you notice?" she asked. The woman frowned. "It's warm but cooler underneath." Kira smiled. Others followed, some military, some not, all drawn by something they couldn't fully explain. She never advertised, never demonstrated beyond what was necessary. She taught them to walk first, to stop, to feel, to wait. Many left frustrated. A few stayed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the desert stretched long shadows across the land, Kira stood alone again, watching the wind move through grass and stone. She felt her grandfather then, not as memory but as presence. Not pride. Peace. She understood something at last. The shot had never been the point. Neither had redemption. What mattered was continuity, that the thread hadn't been broken, that listening had been passed forward intact. She closed her eyes and breathed. The desert answered, as it always had. Quietly, and somewhere between patience and courage, between silence and action, a simple truth settled into her bones, one she would never need to carve into wood. Sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive on time. Sometimes dignity doesn't demand to be seen. Sometimes it waits, and when it finally acts, it doesn't shout. It simply speaks through what it does.